I know there's a handful of folks here from Broome County as well, so I'm really excited that we're able to do that. I do just want to ask too, just to follow in what Haley was mentioning about keeping our cameras on because we all want to see your smiling faces, that you're going to want to also just change your name because I'm not sure that we're going to know in the end who admin might be or iPhone, whatever it might be. So if you're not sure how to do that, you're just going to click on the three dots and you can change your name. You can rename yourself to
We
whatever
actually have a
your
survey
actual
at
name
the
is.
end that gives a section for everyone to include their name. So we should have that covered as
Perfect.
well. Yep.
Great. All right. So, as Haley mentioned, I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Broome County, but I also am one of the statewide co-chairs for the Cornell Cooperative Extension Agritourism Program Work Team. And you might be asking what that is. And that is a statewide group of stakeholders who support agritourism, including extension educators, folks from I Love New York, Ag and Markets, and many others. And so this is a group that started about 3 years ago with really the hope that we wanted to figure out how we can best support agritourism operations across the state. We're very lucky that many of the folks that are on the program work team also operate agritourism enterprises. And so we've really tried to start from the very beginning with really trying to figure out, get a handle on what is agritourism. And so we're lucky that in New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets that they have created a definition for agritourism, and I'm sure that Nan will be talking about this later, but they've defined agricultural tourism as activities conducted by a farmer on farm for the enjoyment and or education of the public, which primarily promote the sale, marketing, production, harvesting, or use of the products of the farm and enhance the public's understanding and awareness of farming and farm life. And so I think that's a really great way to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about tonight, what you're going to be hearing about, because I know that sometimes this can be a little bit of a gray area. So we wanted to let all of you know what resources exist that are supporting this work across the state. And so the first is that there is a statewide website which has some really great resources, which I'm going to show to all of you very quickly. And I will just pop these into the chat as well so that you can, save them for later or follow along, whichever you prefer. But we just want to let folks know that, agritourism is, alive and well. And, at last count, there was over 600 farms that, operate an agritourism enterprise. And so when we're thinking about what resources there are to support them, we have a YouTube channel, and so I just want to show that to all of you quickly, and that has recorded webinars that have been happening over the past year and a half on all sorts of different topics for agritourism enterprises, even down to urban agritourism or agritourism that happens within the urban core, as well as everything up to, how to work with your tourism promotion authority, business planning, staffing, and everywhere in between. So that's a really great resource for folks. And then as well, there are some really great fact sheets that have been created. And so through that, basically, if folks want to just pull something quickly about, related to agritourism, we have one that's talking about where it's allowed. And so that'll kind of be in the same vein as a lot of you are going to be talking about tonight. So the last piece that I just wanted to share quickly, and I just want to stop my share for a second so that I can make sure I'm going to show you the correct graphic, is our program work team has spent a lot of time really trying to define what agritourism looks like within New York State. And so we like to think of it as being something that has different levels to it. So within this, initial core of the graphic that you see here today, and we can share this out as well, is what we all think of as that traditional agritourism, right? You pick or you cut, corn mazes, farm stands, farm to table dinners, farm stays, on farm classes, those types of things. And then as we move further out, in these areas of education or direct sales, things like farmers markets, which drive folks to those farms that they may find at the farmers markets, or when we're thinking about entertainment, those things that will happen that, are more in the entertainment vein that will bring folks onto the farm. Outdoor recreation, which we know is really big driver here in New York State, and how that can relate back to agritourism. And then finally, the education piece and all the different opportunities that there are there, ag museums, ag fairs, all these types of things that, may in the periphery not seem like agritourism, but really are that opportunity for, thinking about how can we drive folks to agritourism, and for all of you, thinking about what does that mean for the work that you all are doing. So I will share this graphic with Haley, and she can send it out to all of you when you get your certificate by the end of next week, as she said. But I really wanted to just make everyone aware of what these resources are, that they do exist, and we will be looking to create a specific section on the website for municipal resources, because what I failed to mention at the beginning is that the impetus for this training that you are all on here tonight came out of an annual professional development that all of the extension folks do, where it was brought up that it seemed like this was really a need for the municipal folks. And so, that came straight out of that. And so what I hope is that if all of you have ideas about needs that you're seeing in your community, that this program work team can think about addressing through creation of resources, educating the producers that we work with on a regular basis, then we want this to be a two-way street and be, something that can feed into itself. So I definitely would love to give you that opportunity, through the evaluation at the end, if there's things that as extension we can be working on with the producers. We don't know what we don't know, so please, make sure to give that feedback, and we will do what we can, just like how we made this training happen. So with that, I'm going
Thank
to
you so much, Laura.
be quiet, and we can
So
move on.
we've had a few more people join us. So if you're just coming in, I want to remind everyone that if you're here to earn credits, please keep your camera on through the class. I've had a few people message me with some technical trouble. Just do your best to troubleshoot, and please just let me know if you are having any difficulty. Just send me a message. So I'd like to also introduce Nan and Melinda. So Melinda's here with me from CCE Sullivan. She's our Ag Program Director and our staff support for the Ag and Farmland Protection Board. And she also does the Ag districts for Sullivan County. So she's going to be here as a great resource for everybody. And so at the end of class, we're going to save about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So please feel free to post those in the chat as we go. And then once we save some time for that, I'll start kind of reading them off in order, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And Melinda and I are both here to support that as well. And last but not least, I will introduce Nan Stolzenberg. She's an AICP planner and the owner of Community Planning and Environmental Associates. And she's going to be leading us all tonight with some really valuable stuff. So Nan, I will pass it to you.
Okay. Was Melinda gonna had something to bring up too before I launch into it?
Nope, I'm just
No.
here as a resource if there's
Okay,
that
gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, let me share my screen. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Is that up for everybody? Okay, great. So this training is really oriented to the municipal side of things. Although I hope that if there's any farmers out there that are listening, that this will be informative for them as well. But it's really designed to help towns and villages and planning boards and ZBAs recognize some of the issues that we often see with planning and projects that are going through zoning boards and planning boards, when it comes to agriculture. So that Laura talked about a much broader amount of resources and information that's out there. We're going to kind of target the steps and the things to start thinking about to help make your town or municipality think about the municipal side of things as more farm friendly. So so Laura gave a definition of agritourism from one particular definition that is in the Agritourism Safety Act. But the key to understanding agriculture and agritourism is that its object, and what we're trying to do is to combine agriculture with tourism experiences that on the farmer side, we're trying to boost farmers' income. These are considered farm operations and part of the farm to promote farming and farmland protection. So it's from the farmer's perspective, agritourism is an economic activity. From a tourism side, agritourism brings people to have rural experiences and drive a more agriculturally related economic situation in that community. And we've certainly certainly since COVID, and even before that, we've seen a rising interest in agritourism, and that's people's desire for going to rural areas, getting out of urban areas for a rural experience, and having some, more authentic food-related local food. There's a huge interest in local foods and desire for fresh food. So we've seen a huge increase in agritourism operations and interest in that, both from the farmer's perspective as well as from the people who are going to these places. So going back to Laura's round chart, we can kind of think of agritourism does go beyond just the typical you pick Christmas tree kind of things that have been around for quite a while. Over the last, 5-10 years, it certainly has expanded into all sorts of different kinds of operations that when we're thinking of it with our municipal hat on, in particular in zoning, it sometimes makes a difference of whether you're doing a farm stay or a U-pick operation, because our zoning needs to accommodate all of those different types of operations. So you can see that all of these things here potentially have some connection to a farm operation that is growing and producing some sort of product. And so we see, everything from U-picks, farm stays, tasting rooms that are associated with wineries and cideries, farm weddings, farm tours, farm restaurants. And what I don't have on here is also more of the educational opportunities that bring people to a farm to understand how farms work. But these are all different types of agritourism that we have to kind of think about. And oftentimes in zoning, we'll see either farm as a definition in your zoning, or sometimes agriculture. Rarely do we see a term that actually defines agriculture. And even more rarely do we see all of these things defined as an allowed use in a farm area in our zoning district, in our zoning law. So we kind of have to start thinking broadly about what agritourism is. And the reason this is important for us to kind of wrap our head, for those of us who are working in rural areas and promoting rural areas, the benefits, there's a lot of benefits to agritourism. The main one that I like to think of is that it is an economic diversification for farmers. The agricultural economy right now is tough, and farmers need to find a way to diversify their operations in order to keep going. So diversifying into one of those kinds of operations that you bring direct sales in, or market their products in a different way is just getting to be super important in most places. And many farmers are trying to figure out on the farming side how to do business plans and develop those kind of agritourism. But in terms of the community's outlook, the agritourism encourages entrepreneurship. It can increase local tax revenues. And this next one, in terms of preserving rural landscapes and farmland, I think is one of the most important. When we talk about farmland protection programs, is you can't protect farmland if you don't have farmers. And if you don't have economically successful farms, you won't have farmers. So the economy of why farmers are doing economic agritourism activities is super important and very connected to farmland and rural community character preservation. So we need to start thinking that there's a different role for agritourism there. Of course, it promotes local food and sustainable practices. And promoting the understanding of agriculture and rural lifestyles. And I think that one of the things that we see is a detriment to rural areas and to farming is this disconnect that we have between farmers and non-farmers. Is that non-farmers, they go to the grocery store or even a local farmers market, and they don't really have a connection to how food is grown, when it's grown, what are the tools and the methods that farmers use. And it can be a real detriment to rural communities when the non-farm community doesn't understand what farmers need to do to grow their crops. So having agritourism is a really important tool to help the community as a whole understand farming. And if you want to keep farming in a community and you want to maintain so that you don't have these clashes between farm practices and non-farm people who aren't used to spraying or, in the middle of the night, or irrigation and the click, click, click of the nozzles going. We want people to understand why those things are happening. So there's a lot of benefits to agritourism from that perspective. And, broadly, we look at agritourism as helping rural employment growth. Farmers always have a hard time with finding labor and help on the farms, but having more agritourism offers more opportunities and stimulates employment in those areas. As I mentioned, it leads to economic growth in rural economies. And this last one, as I said a minute ago, is really important to give people unique farm experiences that help them understand why rural communities matter, why our rural landscapes are important, what a working landscape is, what it takes to grow food, is only going to benefit our farm community as a whole, long term. But there are potential issues that we face. And so this is really where we're talking about where zoning comes in and where we have issues with some agritourism operations that rise up to a land use regulatory question that often comes up, and that many small communities are not very well equipped to answer the questions that come up. So this picture that you're seeing here, if you've ever watched the Jeremy Clarkson's Clarkson Farm show on, I don't know if it's Netflix or one of those stations, this is a picture of this is in England, Diddley Squat Farm Shop. But it's the whole show is a really great example of the issues that come up when you're trying to do agritourism. And if you've watched that show, you've seen how difficult it has been for that particular farm in that country to get the permits and do the kinds of things, the restaurant and the store that they want to do. So even though that's in England, we have some of the same problems over here. Many agritourism operations have parking on local roads because they don't have parking areas or large enough parking areas to bring in the crowds. Some of our agritourism operations have busloads of people coming and are not equipped to address the kind of traffic that comes in. That becomes a land use regulatory issue in many communities. And so the traffic that goes along with that, we often have noise issues where you have events that have bands or other kinds of noises that go on that non-farmers or people in the area start getting concerned about and will complain to the town about the noise that's going on. And I'm not saying all agritourism does this, but it can be an issue in some places. Signage and lighting is another concern. Signage and lighting is a concern that I'm sure many of you deal with just for regular, non-farm development as well. But I think that there's a lot of communities that worry about agritourism, that when it gets really successful and you have all these people coming in, that people start worrying about that it's going to change their road, their neighborhood, their district, or their whole community. And it is, some people call it like the commercialization of agriculture, where it becomes more retail and less agriculture. And so it spurs other kinds of growth and other kinds of activities that ends up changing the community in a way that people fear. And so we will always worry in rural communities about new uses that change the character. And so those are some of the issues that come up when agritourism is on the table from a municipal side. Of course, we want our agritourism to be successful. We want all these people to be coming, but we also don't want to do it in a way that adversely impacts the community, because that's not good for the farmer, especially. And it often then leads to other regulations that end up stymieing and hurting the farmer. So we want to take care of these things, and there are ways to take care of these things in a way that allows us to balance and move forward with both. So the challenge is that we see that zoning can impose, we're wearing the farmer's hat, is that there's often restrictions that impose that prevent farmers from diversifying. There's many places that don't allow other farm businesses on a farm operation, or that specifically don't allow or don't address agritourism. So it's this kind of like black hole out there, and farmers don't know whether what they want to do is allowed or not allowed based on the zoning. Inflexible zoning is especially an issue because it limits farmers' ability to capitalize on their land and to promote and grow their products. So sometimes we find small things in like a definition, where a definition for a farm, for instance, limits it by acres, or a definition in zoning would limit the number of animals that a farmer can have. And so those are often unseen. We don't usually have farmers, unless they're doing agritourism, we don't often have a farm like a dairy farmer who comes to a planning board and said, hey, I want to do a dairy farm. And so we have a lot of these old definitions that are hanging around in zoning laws that really are farm unfriendly. And when it comes to agritourism, it kind of leads us down into this inflexible path that makes it very difficult for farmers to do the kind of farming and diversification that they need to do. And sometimes zoning can conflict with other tourism related needs. Like, so for instance, if you have an agritourism event or activity going in and you're bringing in people to your community, and it's growing and it's great, but the zoning doesn't allow other things that would support that tourism, such as restaurants or there's all sorts of things that zoning laws prevent in rural areas, small inns, bed and breakfast, those kinds of things. They're related. And so we want to make sure that there aren't any regulatory conflicts. So farmers may have to deal with getting event permits. Sometimes agritourism is seasonal, or sometimes it's just an event, one event in the fall, or a couple events during a season. And they're faced with having to go through a long and involved process to get a permit for a special event. Some zoning laws require special use permits, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that can be especially problematic when we mix this kind of requirement for a special use permit in a New York State agricultural district, where really getting a special use permit is frowned upon. Some agritourism event opportunities need site plan review. Some people are forced to get a variance for setbacks or hours of operation or uses on the farm. There's all sorts of things that farmers get sent to the ZBA for a variance on. And as I mentioned before, some zoning laws have supplemental regulations that need to be met before you can be considered even a farm: acreage, number of animals, and things like that, that really conflict with not only ag and markets laws and guidelines, but certainly are not what we would consider farm friendly. And so the thing that I have down on the bottom here, I think even worse, is when a zoning law doesn't address any of these things. And it leaves both the town and the planning board and the farmer in this unknown realm where they want to do a direct sale operation on their farm, or they want to open up a tasting room for their brewery, or whatever it might be. And they go to the town and say, hey, I want to do this activity. And there's nothing in the zoning that addresses that. There's no definitions. There's nothing in the use table that would help identify whether it's allowed or not allowed, or how it's allowed, or what the requirements are. And that breeds a lot of uncertainty and frustration on both parts. So when a zoning law doesn't address any of these topics is as bad as when you have over regulations of agritourism kinds of operations in your zoning. So we have to pay attention that sometimes this, like that neglect, is equally difficult. And I think that we have all sorts of, towns have spent a lot of time regulating various commercial uses, and agriculture has always kind of been, oh, we're going to permit agriculture. And it's not looked at by many planning boards in the same way as any other kind of small business. And so it's kind of just out there in our zoning law, oftentimes with just a P in the use chart, meaning it's permitted. It doesn't have to go to the planning board. But then you start getting, like a retail store on a farm, and people start scratching their head and wonder, yeah, is that allowed or is it not allowed? So it's really, I think, in everyone's best interest to plan for these things and think about these things and accommodate what's needed in the community ahead of time. So whatever the rules are clearly laid out in the beginning. So before we get into some specific zoning things, I think it's like super fundamental and foundational to understand the relationship between a town zoning and the New York State ag and markets law and some other state laws, and how they relate. Because whether you're in a New York State agricultural district or not, makes a big difference when it comes to land use regulations. So we're going to talk a minute about how these other laws impact agritourism. And the ones that I'm going to touch upon are the New York State Safety and Agritourism Act, right to farm laws, the New York State Agricultural District Law, which is 25AA, and then to be aware of that various state and county Department of Health rules often are needed to be paid attention to as well when it comes to agritourism, depending on what kind of agritourism it is. So we're going to go through some of these and think about them a little bit. So the first one is the New York State Safety and Agritourism Act. I think it's maybe not well known by many communities, maybe even by many farmers, but it addresses a whole lot of things that are critical to agritourism. It talks about liability and the direction that the state has gone in to protect and help farmers with the insurance and the liability issue. It does address trespassing and animal welfare, food safety. It discusses taxation and things that you wouldn't maybe expect, things like making sure that your agritourism activity addresses the American Disabilities Act. And so things like having wash stations, hand washing stations, and having a sign so that people recognize that it's a working farm and not just a museum. There are things in this Agritourism Act that you can easily include in your zoning law, in your site plan law, or whatever you're going to be requiring agritourism activity to go through some sort of permitting process. Be aware of this law, look at what it requires, and build those things right into what is going to be asked for on an application or a site plan. That just coordinates it and makes them all consistent. So there's no surprises for either the farmer who's trying to do this or the planning board. And so we can and many of these things like the hand washing station and having ADA parking spots in appropriate locations with the sign, those are things the planning board can address during some sort of site plan review. So I think this is a really important one to keep in mind, be familiar with, and we can certainly send the link out to everybody so that you could read it and see what the components of that are. The right to farm laws. So the state right to farm law, there is a state right to farm law that comes from New York's Ag and Markets law. That's the Ag Districts Law 25AA. And in Sullivan County, I was going to ask Haley or Melinda again. I think there are 11-ish towns in Sullivan County, and certainly across the state. I know many of you are from other locations. There are many, many counties and towns that have county and town level right to farm laws as well. And the major thrust of these right to farm laws is that it protects farmers against nuisance claims. And it basically says that in a New York State agricultural district, so we need to make a distinction between your local zoning district that might be called agriculture or rural agriculture, or sometimes they're called agricultural residential districts. That is not what we're talking about when we use the term New York State Agricultural District. The New York State Agricultural District was established through 25AA, and its design is to promote agriculture, to prevent agricultural operations from being overregulated, and to really say that agriculture in those areas is a primary land use there. And so most state most county and local right to farm laws have a right to farm statement in it that says, we're a community that promotes our farms, and we consider that as a primary land use. but they also have a section in there that talks about mediation and how conflicts between farmers and farm operations and other people can be mediated without it going to court. So we have to look at first whether your town or county has a right to farm law. If you're in the New York State Agricultural District, farmers are, have that level of protection at the state level as well. But when we're talking about agritourism, then the question is, does agritourism fall under that right to farm provision? And we need to explore that more to understand, is this a farm operation that is protected under the New York State Agricultural Districts program? So I recommend that on your planning board, if you're not aware of whether the town or the county has a right to farm law, you look into it to see what's out there. So the New York State Agricultural and Markets Law, that's AML 25A, was adopted in 1971. As I said, it includes the state's right to farm law. It establishes these agricultural districts, of which there are agricultural districts in every county in the state. And as I said, it requires careful coordination between your local planning at the town level and land use decisions that you're making, and the guidance and the requirements of the ag districts law. And it's a little disheartening for me. I'm often involved in projects where we review or audit local zoning laws to see how farm friendly they are. And in many communities who are very rural and where agriculture is the primary land use, and you review those zoning laws, and you find all sorts of things that really are not agriculturally friendly. And so we need to pay attention to helping make sure that we're consistent with that guidance from the state. That's what's going to ultimately help our farmers, because they have voluntarily joined the New York State Ag District. So it's not your zoning district that imposes a boundary on them. Landowners who want to join in and become part of a New York State Ag District can voluntarily request to be added to an ag district once a year. And then the county's role is to review that New York State Ag District for the farms that are in it, and make adjustments to that as time goes on every 8 years. And so farm properties can come and go into the New York State Ag District. But ultimately, we want to look at that ag district law as protecting farm operations in those locations from unreasonably restrictive land use regulations. And that takes us back to the question, is the agritourism activity that is being proposed part of a farm operation that is protected through the New York State Ag Districts program? And those are really important questions to ask when you are certainly developing or updating your zoning law. And we find all the time conflicts between a zoning law says one thing and they regulate something, highly regulate something, or require a special use permit for something which is inconsistent with what the ag and markets law at the state level is trying to do. So in 25A, section 301, there's a definition for a farm operation, which I think is really important. This is not necessarily agritourism related, but I would ask all of you to go to your zoning law and read what your definition for a farm operation is, if you have one. Sometimes it's called farm, sometimes it's called agriculture. Sometimes it's a farm operation. But this is basically defining a farm operation as an entity, a commercial entity, a commercial enterprise that is in the business, all of the buildings, equipment, manure processing and handling, and practices which contribute to the production, preparation, and marketing of the crops, animal husbandry, and other products. And it includes things like horse boarding, apiaries, fish farming, and other things are included in the definition of agriculture. So those are the activities that are protected and fall under the Ag and Markets Law. And so when we're talking about agritourism, this is where it comes in, as we're trying to market crops, animal husbandry products, and other products that we get from growing plants or raising animals to support that farm operation. And that's, I think, a really important foundational concept to connect to agritourism, because there are different kinds of agritourism that, you might have a piece of land and you import pumpkins from Pennsylvania and you sell pumpkins on a wagon from that location. Is that agritourism? Is it a farm operation that's protected? Do you require them to get a permit? Do you not require them to get a permit? Those are all kind of fundamental questions from the planning board side of things and the zoning side of things that we ask and have to think about. How does that fit in, and how does it fit into your local regulations? So the agritourism, the premise is that it's benefiting the farm. It's benefiting the sale, marketing, and harvesting of those farm products. So you are bringing in people to sell something, or you're bringing in people to market the product that you're making, or you're bringing in people to, learn about the farm and experience the farm in support of that farm operation. So many times and this is a kind of a case-by-case basis, that one application may be different than the next application. And you have to kind of go through the thought process about, is it an agritourism operation? Is it a farm operation? And they might be the same, they might not be. So there's, as Laura had talked about in the beginning, there's a ton of resources out there for everybody to learn about the Ag and Markets guidance. They have a set of guidance documents that are super helpful. And if you haven't had a chance to look through these guidance documents, they're really, like this one up here, local laws in agricultural districts, how do they relate, very much explains this interaction between your local zoning law and the ag district rules. I think everyone on a planning board should be familiar with how that interaction works. In particular, I think when we're looking at agritourism, these two documents that are highlighted, I think, are especially helpful. This first one, the guideline for reviewing of local laws affecting direct farm marketing activities, and the one reviewing how your local law affects farm distilleries and breweries. And so those are very helpful for you to help understand, again, that interaction I should say, between what you need to follow through in a New York State ag district and your local zoning. So here's an example of an agritourism definition from a community. It's kind of long, but I think that it ties together a couple of the concepts that we've been talking about. So first of all, there is a definition in this particular community for agritourism. That's a step in the right direction, that you actually have a definition in your zoning for agritourism. that you include it in your use table as a line item, just like you would a retail operation or an inn or anything else that you would have in your use table. Agritourism gets recognized as something that is allowed in the community, and that we have a definition. So you can see that it kind of mimics what we just talked about. It's an active farm operation engaged in the production, preparation, and marketing of all of these things, which brings together tourism, agriculture. And then it goes through, here's the other part of it, is this second part goes through all sorts of things that this zoning law considers to be part of agritourism. So I think I put this in because I think it not only ties together that our agritourism is associated with promoting farms and active farm operations, but it also tells you what those are. Everything from hay rides, corn mazes, farm tours, festivals, and all of these other things. So when an application comes to the town, someone wants to do some sort of agritourism operation, you guys on the planning board, or if it gets to the ZBA for some reason, you have a definition to go off of, and you can say, oh yes, you want to do a hay ride, and you're a farm, you're a dairy farm, and you want to augment your income in the fall by having a hay ride every weekend in October. You have something to go on. This was just since this training originated primarily for Sullivan County, I had put this map up to show the ag districts in Sullivan County. You guys who are in different counties would have a similar map for your county, but the areas in green show the New York State agricultural districts in that county. And you can see that on this side, for instance, this kind of is like a critical mass of farmland that's enrolled in the agricultural district. This is a little more, parcel by parcel basis that have been determined to be legitimate farm operations that can be in an agricultural district. And so we can look at our zoning with kind of two pathways. One is that you want to treat farms that are in your ag district. You need to follow the ag and markets guidance for those farms and not overregulate activities on those farms. If you want to be truly, like, really ag friendly, then you want to make sure that, because there might be farms that are not in the New York State Ag District, and you can regulate those differently than you can for the ones that are in the New York State Ag District. But certainly if you're a community whose goal is to promote agriculture, you might not want to treat them differently. Some communities do, but certainly within these ag districts, those are where we want to pay particular attention to. What are you requiring the farmer to do? Are you requiring them to get a special use permit? That's kind of a no-no. Are you requiring them to have a certain amount of acreage in order to have a farm? That's kind of another no-no as well. So we really have to learn about this interaction between the zoning in the New York State ag districts. So the Ag and Markets has a very nice guidance document on direct sales on farms that are in a New York State agricultural district. And it talks in great detail about what it considers to be part of a farm operation and what it does not consider to be part of a farm operation. It considers agritourism a direct marketing, again, with the notion that we're trying to sell things from that the farm is growing or producing. Agritourism, both from their guidance and certainly in my opinion, should be allowed as an activity on farm operations in the New York State ag districts. Again, you can regulate them differently somewhere else outside of those ag districts, but within the ag district, agritourism operations should be an allowable use. It's not that we can't regulate agritourism operations. It's that we can't over-regulate them, and we need to not put up roadblocks to. So from the state hat on, we're looking at a farm operation in an ag district is the principal and the primary use in that area. So it should not be over-regulated. But there are things that from an agritourism and a direct sales point of view that are reasonable. And we can, look at dimensions of certain buildings where the public might come in, or the size of a sign. The guidance does talk about how much of a percentage of local grown products can be sold versus bringing in other things. And so it has specifically for a direct sale on a farm in a New York certified ag district that at least 51% of the products sold must be from the farm's own production. So if you are an orchard and you're selling apples and fruit, and you make pies as a value added product, and you're bringing in people to do apple picking, but you also sell shirts and t-shirts and hats and all these other things that aren't made or grown on the farm, then in order to have that same kind of protections from being in the agricultural district, we have to pay attention to this 51%. And farmers really need to keep good records of what they're selling and what percentage of things that they're selling. So it's not unreasonable to require a permit for some sort of agritourism operation. Site plan review may be reasonable depending on the size and scope of the agritourism operation. And we're going to talk in a minute about some ways that you can modify your site plan review to be more of an abbreviated process for agritourism operations. This one, special use permits are usually not reasonable. They're frowned upon. And basically, the special use permit requirement is saying, we're regulating your use. The difference between site plan and special use permit is site plan regulates the things on the ground and how they function. The special use permit is regulating the use itself. It's looking at, is there noise? Is there hours of operation? Is there something about that use that needs to be regulated? That's where, if you're in a New York State agricultural district and you're doing agritourism, that's where the special use permit could be seen as unreasonable. So again, the direct sales where you have agritourism, it's really looking for a predominance of products grown from the farm, but it certainly doesn't require you to have only local products that you've grown on the farm. You can have other things as part of the operations. And so one of the examples that I used when I did this training in person is a wedding venue. So a wedding venue, someone has a property, they have a barn, and they start a business on that property to be a wedding venue. It may have been a farm, it may be a farm, but they're using a building or a barn for a wedding venue. Is that part of the farm operation, or is it not? And I would say that in a New York State ag district, actually probably everywhere, it may not be, it may be considered a tourism operation and a legal business based on your zoning. But if it's not selling any products from that farm, it's not promoting that farm in any way, it's just a wedding venue, it's a building where you're bringing people in, it's a commercial entity, different than a wedding venue that maybe they have a distillery or a winery, or they're growing beef and they serve the beef as part of the reception. That's a different story. So we have to kind of tease out these different kinds of operations that are showing up in our communities. Just a couple other things about agritourism on farms in New York ag districts is basically the prepackaged kind of processed, bags of potato chips and some of these other things that you often see. They're not items that are protected under the ag districts law. And you can limit the percentage of those products that are sold. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good idea to do that, but you can do that. And things like festivals that a lot of farms have, fall fests and things like that. They are part of a farm operation if they're directly related to the farm, and that again, there's a tie to the actual farming operation behind it. So that's one level of thinking about how to be farm friendly for agritourism. The summary of that is to look at your zoning, look at your definitions, look at your use schedule and your supplemental regulations, and become familiar with the New York State Ag District and the Agricultural or Agritourism Act, Safety and Agritourism Act, sorry, and see how consistent they are. So let's talk about some more just regular zoning considerations. So, zoning often has a bad name. People grumble about zoning all the time, but it can be a very important tool. And I think that when they're done right and they're tailored to your community, they certainly can add certainty so that agritourism knows what the rules are. They know what's expected. They know whether they have to get a permit or not. And that certainty is going to be helpful from the farmer's perspective as they're building their business and moving forward with it. It's the uncertainty and the time and the expense and the effort that goes into maneuvering through. The building inspector doesn't know whether it's an allowed activity. It has to go to the ZBA for an interpretation. The ZBA doesn't really know. That adds time and expense and makes it very difficult. And then you add on the New York State Ag District, part of that, if they're in an ag district, and it makes it even more complicated. So having your zoning outline these things gives certainty and direction for everybody, both the planning board and the person who's doing the application. I think it also helps balance agricultural, commercial, and residential interests. Most of our rural communities are low density residential areas as well, and we have non-farmers that are mixing in with our farm community, and the town or the village needs to balance all of those kind of often conflicting goals that a community has. On one hand, lots of people who live in a rural community love their rural community and they love the farms. But then when they have, 50 buses on a weekend drive up with people to pick apples and they're parked 5 miles down the road, then they start getting upset. So that's where that balance comes in. And it allows us to address legitimate concerns about noise and traffic in this kind of commercialization. having zoning can address those infrastructure needs, especially related to parking. That's a really big one. Just oftentimes we're just not equipped to deal with what the parking needs are for these things. And of course, by having, you have a bathroom, you have porta potties or whatever is going to be required from a health and safety point of view, that can minimize land disturbances and other kinds of issues that come up. So I don't want to give the impression that zoning is not an important tool. I think zoning is a very important tool, but we have to do it right. And we have to be smart about the kinds of things we're putting in there related to agritourism. So I think it's like super important. Where do we start? Well, we start with your community's comprehensive plan. And if we were like in a room and everyone was sitting there, I would ask everybody, is your comprehensive plan recent? Has it been done in the last, even 10 years would be great. 5 years would be even better. And then open up your comprehensive plan. Does it have a section on agriculture? Does it talk about agriculture? Does it talk about the desire of the community to promote farm activities and agritourism? That's the document that starts you having the policies to have the right kind of zoning to address agritourism. So I would encourage you all to pull out your comprehensive plan, look and see how up to date it is. Look and see whether it even mentions agricultural districts. There's many, many communities in rural areas that don't have that don't have comprehensive plans that are up to date. So the comprehensive plan is where you start. And if it's old and it doesn't address a policy to be ag friendly and to promote agritourism and to define what ag tourism is like in your community, that's where you should be starting. And you should be working with your town board and your elected officials to get that up to date. And to have at least have a map of your county's ag districts in your town. So when something comes up, you know where that is. So when you are starting to look at your zoning you are facing, and someone wants to do some sort of agritourism operation, these are the kinds of questions that are typical ones you should be asking. Is it a commercial activity that happens to be in a rural area on a farm that really doesn't have anything to do with the farm operation? That might be very different than, is it part of the farm operation and it's selling and marketing whatever that farm is growing? Here's our next one. Does it meet the direct sale definitions and guidance? And what are your siting concerns? Is it a parking? Does it need signage? Many rural communities have dirt roads, and can the road handle the traffic that might be coming up that road to get to that agritourism activity? Those are all legitimate questions that the community could and should be asking about. Will there be noise? This is an example here, this picture of a farm activity on a farm. It is a farm operation, but you can see it was a big concert with lots of people, lots of cars, lots of noise. Who will hear it? What hours are they going to be having the band? How many days is it going to be? Is it going to be every day? Is it going to be once? Is it going to be all fall? Those are all legitimate questions that planning boards should be asking, and your zoning laws should be supporting. And then going back to our New York State Safety and Agritourism Act, do you have in place consistency so that it's easy for the farmer to meet those kinds of requirements? Because they're going to have to anyway. So what would a farm-friendly zoning law look like? What it would be? Well, we want it to be adaptable. We want it to be flexible, to be able to foster agritourism. And there's always new kinds of things coming up. Farmers are super inventive, and They come up with new products and new crops and new ways of marketing their products all the time. So we don't want our zoning, especially our definitions, to be so pigeonholed that they're too narrow. We want the zoning to address and be upfront about those conflicting interests of agricultural operations conflicting with residential and other land uses that are in the area. We don't want to overregulate, but those are legitimate things to think about. We want to think about preservation versus development and understand that fundamentally what we're trying to do here is to promote farms, maintain local food systems, build connections between all people and where their food comes from. So you want to be able to have that kind of as a philosophy baked into where your land use regulations are going. And of course, safety. We always are looking at safety regulations for the visitor protection and promoting responsible agritourism. So that's kind of a spot to start with thinking about what would make your zoning law or is your zoning law ag friendly and agritourism friendly. So as I've said multiple times already, we want to have agritourism related definitions that and I don't want to like keep repeating it, but I can't tell you how important those definitions are. They're fundamental. You can never, in my opinion, you can never have too many definitions that relate to agritourism or agriculture. The more clarity we can give, the better. This next one we haven't really talked about yet in the zoning, and that is the zoning's purpose statements. And if you open up your town zoning, the first or second section at the very beginning of your zoning document will be purpose statements or the intent. And it's basically the philosophy. What are you as a community trying to accomplish by having zoning? We don't just have zoning for the sake of zoning. We have zoning to meet certain community goals. Well, why isn't agriculture and agritourism one of your goals? You should look at your purpose statements and see A, whether it's connected to your comprehensive plan, and B, does it mention that one of your goals by having regulations is to promote certain land uses like agriculture and active farm operations? You should have that in your purpose statements. I think that's a fundamental philosophical starting place to enhance your farm friendliness. As I mentioned before, your use table should, instead of just having farm or agriculture, it should list agritourism specifically as a use. Again, you may want to have site plan review for some of those activities, or you may be in a situation where you're happy, just you want it in any form, in any place. And so it's a permitted use across the board, that just like a farm operation, and that's fine too. If you don't feel you need to have any kind of regulations towards it, great. But at least then a farmer who wants to do an agritourism opportunity looks in your zoning law and like, oh, look, there it is, agritourism. That's me. It's a permitted use. I can just do it. I don't need to go to the planning board for that. So that would give clarity to update your use table to include those activities. And then your supplemental standards, we talked about that you can really have one set of rules for if you're in an ag district, this is allowed. Like many communities have a use table where they'll say, for instance, a farm, distillery, winery, and cidery on a farm operation is a permitted use, or maybe it needs a modified site plan review. But outside of a New York State ag districts, it's a regular business and it goes through the normal site plan. It's not treated the same as a farm operation. So you can make that distinction in your community if there's the need to do that. So again, these are the kinds of things that we look for in our definitions. I certainly have no problem with communities just having a definition for agritourism, but certainly if you want to have all of these others, they are different things. An agricultural business is not agritourism, but maybe a farmer does custom harvesting on the side. That's not, it's a totally different business. So that's an agricultural business. You might have agricultural processing. You have a, you're brewing something, you're taking a potato crop and making vodka out of it. You're doing something with that product on there. You may have special events like Farm Fest, pumpkin, you pick pumpkin types things. So all of these things, you should not be afraid of actually thinking about, defining in your zoning and deciding how those need to be treated. So I see this got cut off a little bit, but some of the standards that we can look at, setbacks can be reasonable for an agritourism, especially if it's for health and safety reasons, getting it off the road, moving something away from a sensitive environmental area. Those are things that are not unreasonable to regulate. Certainly parking regulations, traffic flow, the traffic flow of people coming in can be a real problem. I'm sure you've all been to an orchard, for instance, and they have a fall, come pick your own, and people are just pulling in a grassed area and parking their car and off they go to pick their apples. And oftentimes we don't have good traffic flow of cars coming in and out. We don't have special places for people in wheelchairs or who have disabilities who need to have different accommodations to get closer to a structure or a building or something. Signage can be have standards to consider, so the key is that we don't want to think about these after the fact. Our ag friendly regulations will be better serve everyone if you think about these and include them in your zoning. So the rules and the direction and the review is all laid out ahead of time. So you don't have to scratch your head when someone is facing you wanting to do some sort of agritourism operation and you have the answers for them. Whoops, now what am I doing here? I just want to go back because we missed a couple things. That slide is weird. So sorry about that. So let's talk a minute about the review processes that we may or may not force an agritourism operation to go through. We often have things like you have to get a building permit or a zoning permit. So the difference between a building permit is the building permit would meet the New York State building code. A zoning permit would meet the zoning regulations. So it's not unreasonable to ask an agritourism operation to get a building permit if they're going to have a structure that has people coming in. That's a safety issue and it has to meet certain requirements. A zoning permit that might be able to be issued by the building inspector without going to the planning board, and you have certain requirements that if you meet the requirements, you get the zoning permit without having to go through some sort of special review process. So those are things that you can enhance an agritourism land use by not over regulating the process that someone has to go through. As I mentioned before, the special use permit is generally not advised. We want farming, we want farm operations, we want agritourism. We want to address how things are functioning on the land and not the use itself. So I would steer you more towards the site plan review. And this is where, if you look through one of the New York State guidance documents, you'll find the proposal of doing something called a modified site plan review. A modified site plan review can be very helpful by giving your community the chance to have some level of review that's focused. We're going to look at parking. We're going to look at traffic flow. We're going to look at siting in terms of noise and lighting, those kinds of things, but we're not going to have the whole engineered, surveyed site plan review that our normal site plan review process goes through. So the modified site plan review can be incorporated into your zoning law as a special process for agriculture or agritourism operations. They're usually abbreviated. They usually do not have, or at least they make the public hearing a may instead of shall. So it's got some flexibility built in. So if it's a small operation that no one has any concerns about, you can waive the public hearing or not. And the other thing that I don't have it on the slide. Oh, actually I do. I'm sorry. I'm like losing it here tonight. Farm operations are exempt from seeker. So that's a really important thing, is that when you have an agritourism operation that comes in that is part of a farm operation in a New York State ag district, it is exempt from seeker. So you do not do a seeker on those things. But the modified site plan review is a really good tool that you can still look at some of the concerns that we have brought up that make a difference to the community. And I'd also did want to mention that many farm buildings are exempt from getting a building permit. It depends on the community. Some communities exempt them and some don't. But certainly all of your buildings that are public facing buildings in an agritourism, where, like a restaurant, a cafe, a tasting room, any of those kinds of things, those would still have to meet building codes. But your dairy barn, your goat barn, your whatever processing that where you're making jams and jellies. Actually, that might be a commercial kitchen that might need to meet certain codes, but you should check with your building inspector or your building department to find out how they handle building permits. So those are some of the processes to think about. And then we can look a little broader and say, well, what can a community do to really, rather than just make it easy for agritourism to come in, what are some of the zoning methods that we can to use to make it even better? So some communities have an agritourism overlay district. And an overlay district is a zoning district that sits on top of another zoning district. So let's say you have a rural zoning district. It's just, rural, you allow houses, you allow a bunch of other things in there. And then you have a certain area. We go back to that map that we had, like this, the critical area, the critical mass of farms in Sullivan County. Maybe those communities would want to say, hey, these are where we really want to promote ag tourism. And we're going to create an overlay district that sets the standards and the rules to make it clear and easy for, in those areas, agritourism rules. They're going to just go through, that's our preferred land use there. Similarly, you can carve out a zoning district. That's an agritourism or an agricultural tourism zoning district. And you can set buffers. This is not just agritourism, but in general, I always recommend communities allow or require extra space and buffers between non-farm uses and farm uses so that we don't mix and create more conflicts that way. So we give them some extra space. So agricultural buffers may help agritourism, but it may help other farmers as well. We often have complaints where residences are moving in close to where farms are, and during the daytime it's all beautiful and bucolic, and they love seeing the landscape, but then the farmers out there at midnight plowing, or they're out there spraying their orchard in the night, and then people start complaining. So that's the kinds of thing that buffers can help as we are facing more residential development pressure. And these two last ones on this slide, I think, are super important. One is the agricultural data statement. That is actually required through Ag and Markets 25AA, which says if you have an application that comes to your planning board or your ZBA that is in or within 500 feet of an active agricultural actual farm operation in a New York State ag district, part of the application has to include this ag data statement. And it basically identifies the farmers that are nearby and with contact information, so those people can be notified that there's some activity going through the planning board or the ZBA that is near them. And many places don't know about the ag data statement, or it's maybe listed, but they don't know what to do with it. It's usually used to, when the public hearing notice goes out, those people are notified. And it can be significant. I know of several development projects that went through the whole planning board process, and at the end, the ag data statement was not submitted, and it went to court, and the court was like, yeah, you didn't use the ag data statement. Okay, planning board, you got to go back and do it again and use the agricultural data statement. So it can be very significant, but it's farm friendly in the sense that you're notifying farmers about non-farm development that might be going on around them that might impact their operation. And then the other thing is what's called the agricultural disclosure notice. That also comes from New York State Ag and Markets law. And it's required, it's been in place for years, and it generally requires real estate agents, when they're selling property within a New York State agricultural district, to notify the buyer that they're buying land in an ag district, and there might be noises and smells and activities related to farms. So while that's in place for the buying and selling of land, I recommend, as a farm-friendly kind of, it's a small token, but it's still an important one, is that when you have a site plan application or a subdivision in a New York State ag district, you include a plat note or a plan note on the map that says this development is in New York State ag district, whatever the number is in your community. And that way in the future, and then you put the actual disclosure notice right in the note, which says, this parcel is part of a New York State ag district and subject to the, the noises and the smells and all of the other things that go along with farm operations. That way, people in the future who are pulling out that subdivision map or that site plan map have a notice that they are in an ag district. So I just think it's a good practice to have that. Again, a note to always consider your town's comprehensive plan. Make sure agriculture and agritourism is covered, and if it's not covered, to update that plan. A little bit about there is a guidance document from the state for breweries, wineries, and distilleries that are, again, we're talking about in the New York State Ag District. And again, these are the growing, the processing, the distillation, brewing, and all the buildings and the equipment that go into making some sort of beverage. But it also includes the marketing of those products, cider, wine. There's a farm near me that makes vodka out of potatoes. There's all sorts of things. So that is on agritourism, especially when you have a tasting room. It could be direct sales. It could be a tasting room. It could be festivals. It could be all sorts of agritourism activities to bring people to that farm to buy those products. Those are also considered farm operations. The flip side of that is if you're just going to be a brewer and you are bringing in grapes from or grain or whatever you're making in from some other place, and you have a 5-acre lot or a 3-acre lot, and you're building a building and you're going to make the product and sell it there, that is not a farm operation. So that could be treated differently in your zoning law. So those are the kind of fine-tuning things that you want to pay attention to. We talked a little about earlier about special events, weddings, parties, and things like that. These are often decided on a case-by-case basis because it's not always, they're harder to tell whether they're part of a farm operation or not. So the guidance from the New York State Ag and Markets also covers weddings, parties, and special events. And I think that these are certainly becoming very common in many of our rural communities. Many times they are on a farm, and many times they are connected to that farm operation somehow. A cut flower farm, and then they have the flowers at the tables, or it's a brewery and they have the whatever they're making from a beverage point of view. But it may not be part of a farm operation, and so it might be just some other kind of commercial use that happens to be in a farm area. So those might need to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But just like agritourism, I encourage you all to look at your use table in your zoning to see whether wedding events or special event venues are even listed in your use table. How do you deal with that if someone wants to come and do that? You need some guidance. You need to know how those things are going to progress through your process. So kind of finish up here with, I want to leave some time for some questions. These are, and I'll make sure that Melinda and Haley have these, that you can send them out so you can have these links so you know where to find these documents about the New York Safety and Agritourism Act and these guidance documents that we were talking about in earlier. So I think we have about a half an hour left, and we can have a discussion about any questions. I think there might be some questions. So I'm just going to turn my share off now and turn it back over to Haley and see what we do for the next half hour.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Nan. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.